Good morning or good afternoon to everyone today. Thank you so much for joining us. This is actually our last webinar before Connect. Next week, we're all going to be hunkering down and getting those final preparations ready as we all go to San Antonio. So if you haven't registered yet, there's still time to register for the conference. Believe it or not, people are still registering. So it's never too late to do so. You'll see a little bit more information coming out about Connect even next week for those of you who are registered. So do keep an eye on your email for that. But today's session, super excited to have Rick here. We're doing a session on how distributors apply technology to beat the upcoming recession. So I think that's just about every headline you see in the news these days is talking about the recession coming up. And so first of all, as everyone knows, I like to take a moment to thank our user group officers. They do so much work behind the scenes, not just getting ready for Connect, but just other initiatives that we're working on, improving the forum, working with Epicor, of course, to represent y'all. So if you have a moment today, please send them a note of thanks. They can be reached at officers@P21WWUG.org. So a big thank you to Sam, Tim, Ted, Mike, and Tony for all of the volunteer work they do for the group. I don't know how they manage the workload that they do on top of their daily responsibilities and their families. So a huge thank you to them on behalf of me. As I mentioned, Connect 2022, there is still time to register if you want to come. We do have availability in every classroom, so it's not that any classes are even filled at the moment. We still have tons of room. The JW Marriott Hill Country is absolutely stunning, and their rooms are great sizes, so we can accommodate this large group. Rick and I were just talking before the presentation. I'm so excited to remind everyone, or those of you who weren't on the call earlier this week, that we have beat all of our previous set records in attendance for Connect. So we are at over 850 members that are coming this year, which beats our long-standing record from 2019. So I'm pretty excited about that. So as I said, there's still time to register. The JW Marriott is sold out of rooms the last I checked. We don't have any left in our discounted room block, but there are hotels just down the road, a 10-minute drive, where you can get a more competitive rate, and parking at the JW is complimentary, so you don't have to pay to park there. So keep all of that in mind if you're still thinking of coming. As always, I like to touch on our disclaimer slide. This doesn't just pertain to webinars, but forum posts as well. I know Rick and I go way back. I know he's not going to cover anything that he's not going to give you a tip or caution about if needed. I don't think we're getting into any SQL statements at all today, but if we do, I know how he's going to handle it. And of course, you can always reach out to him directly regarding any content that's covered today. But in terms of the webinars in general, the recorded ones as well, and forum posts, to please remember that these are being presented in a volunteer capacity, and to take the information in the spirit in which it's being offered. Always use your Play database and test anything you learn before going live. Talk to the necessary IT professionals within your organization, the presenter of this session, others on the user group forum, or of course Epicor if you have any questions. Last but not least is my contact information. I think most people know how to get a hold of me. As I always say, getting this close to Connect, I do apologize. I am very difficult to get a hold of by phone, but if you email me, I do try to get back to everyone within 24 hours. So if you have any questions regarding Connect or Prophet 21, if you have any questions at all and you don't know where to start, please reach out to me. I don't always know the answers, but I can always find someone who does. So if you're not sure where to go, please reach out whenever you have a moment. So I'm going to take a moment and change presenter over to Rick. And while I do, I just want to remind everyone about how to ask questions today. Our preferred method is to use the question feature here in GoToWebinar. If you're connected using your phone and you want to speak live, you can always raise your hand and I can unmute you. Otherwise, we do ask that you try to put the questions in here so we can group them all together. Please put your questions in as you think about them, and then we know how much time to leave at the end of the session to cover those questions. But without further ado, I'm going to put myself on mute and over to you, Rick.
Thanks, Cheryl. Hey, all right, just a quick question. Are you seeing my screen? Just
yeah,
because
it's
I'm
perfect.
not seeing. Okay, good deal. Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. This is going to be a unique webinar. I've been doing webinars. We're actually going to be in business for almost 30 years come November, and I've been doing webinars for a very long time, as well as other presentations. This is going to be a different one. So this is not going to be the typical webinar that you go through and start talking about all the technology and what's the latest bells and whistles in technology. I'm going to start out with kind of an overview of where are we economically. One of the things that I want to try to do is talk a little bit about the economics and then how does a distributor deal with that. So here's the agenda. I want to do an introduction and tell you where I'm coming from, because that's kind of important that you know where I'm coming from, so that it's not like I'm just pontificating just because I think so. And then this webinar is going to have two sections here, recession definitions and the reaction to recession. And what I'm really going to be doing is kind of taking a bunch of different sources, bringing them together. This isn't any kind of study that Gray Wolf's done or I've done. It's bringing all the pieces of other more knowledgeable people than we are on the concepts of a recession, and dovetail that all into how do you take and apply technology to beat whether you believe there's an upcoming recession or the future of a recession. And then we're going to take questions. By the way, if something happens that you need to ask a question right away, Cheryl's looking at that, and we can go through and have her ask those questions immediately. A little bit of background. Graywolf.com is our website, and I'm going to pop into that real quick here just to show you. It has an about us, and one of the things that you may need to know for this conversation is that we've actually been working. It's funny, we had our first customer using P21 back in 2014. I met Cheryl in that time frame, and in 2015 is when we actually became a member of the Worldwide Users Group. We also at the time were an Epicor services partner, meaning that we were doing implementations of Epicor P21, and that kind of went away when they started changing the contracts with us, so we decided to pass on that as time went on. But that didn't mean that we walked away from the Prophet 21 world. We've got customers both in P21 and P21 Cloud, very focused on that, and we'll get into a little bit more later some of the technology that we're offering in that. Now, that being said, my background and where I'm coming from is I was actually raised in distribution. My dad was an auto parts distributor, and the important part of where that comes into play is I remember, I'm old enough, one of those few people, those of you on the call that are millennials, never experienced hyperinflation. I actually did experience the concepts of that back in 1973, 74, 75, mid-70s. My dad was an auto parts distributor, and we talked about that at that time, as well as over time of what inflation has done. So my background in the distribution industry is starting to kind of go full circle with what we're seeing with the economic situation at this point. I happen to be a certified management accountant, as well as a certified person in solution and strategic. The CSCA is a subset of the management accountant designation, and as well as being a certified computer professional. I've got an MBA in finance. I've got all the finance background, and so where I'm coming from is taking the economic information and try to apply it, and how, if I were a distributor today using P21, how would I use what's going on and move forward with that. With that being said, if Cheryl will throw up a couple of poll questions for us, I'd like to get to know where you're coming from on this aspect, primarily the actual aspects of the recession. And we're going to go into some of these things as well. Cheryl, you've got one up now, correct? I see that.
Yes. Yeah, we just put the first one up, which is, do you believe we are currently in a recession? So super simple, yes or no. So we're at about 50% have voted. So we'll give everyone just another 30 seconds or so.
And while we're talking about this, what I want to try to do is get a feel for, I should have had another question, is who the audience is. If you are a propeller head like myself, or if you're a CEO, or the CFO and doing from an accountant perspective. Cheryl, why don't we do both of them at the same time? So if you just throw the second question up, and then we'll go from there.
So sorry, just so we can quickly take a look at the results of the first one. Sorry.
Okay.
So 82% said yes, and 18% said no to your first question.
Interesting. Okay, let's go to the second one if we could, please.
Sure, hold on one second. There we go. So you'll
Okay,
see the second one is now up.
great. So, and this is probably the important part. You know, the majority of you think that you're in a recession. Now the question is, have you made any kind of adjustments accordingly? And one of the things I'm not going to get into, because we could have a whole roundtable discussion on this, is what are those adjustments you've made? Now, I've got my opinions on that. And there are a lot of things you can and can't do. And I've got actually some studies of where those adjustments would have actually in the past worked. How are we doing on that? Perfect. All right, so about 50-50. So realistically, those of you that do believe we're in a recession, I want to talk to you and say, okay, well, here's what we're seeing. And then what I want to go into is, okay, if we are or aren't, what should you be doing about it? So let's talk about what causes recession. And just so you know, this is not going to be just a bunch of slide decks. I'm going to bring up a few things. This is the article that came up for it. And let's close that guy. So close the ads. And this was an article that was done back in July of 22 of this year. So keep in mind, I'm trying to keep this as current as I possibly can. And the definition of an official recession, you know, is not what I'm going to get into right now. They've got some of their definitions. I'm going to go into that a little bit more in detail here in a minute. But what causes a recession? They talked about some of the things that can cause it. So to summarize that, one of the things is a sudden economic shock. And this is what I experienced as a kid. In the 70s, OPEC cut off the oil supply. It caused hyperinflation because we had the run on oil. And again, just so you understand where I'm coming from on that, my dad had a service station. He had a Conoco service station. He also had an auto parts distributorship that sold to Conoco and Texaco stations in the Colorado area. And when they shut off the oil supply, he actually did quite well as a wholesale distributor. It was one of the best things that could have happened to him was to have this hyperinflation that with the recession that went with it. So he was working in a service station. They would shut down the gas pumps at the beginning because the government was restricting how much profit he could make. But where he was making his money was in the services in the back room of doing things like oil changes and tire rotations and that kind of stuff. And in the wholesale distribution business of the auto parts, he even told me that all he had to do was buy a battery, throw it on the shelf, and that battery gained in value over that year because inflation at that time was not only in the double digits, but it was starting to reach in almost to the 20% aspect. And what you saw was that you throw a battery on the shelf and you made a 20% return on investment just because you kept the stock. Now, obviously, if it's a perishable item, it doesn't work as well. But if you're in that kind of a situation with inflation today, it starts to look good to throw things on a shelf because your value of that item starts to go up. And one of the things we've actually experienced recently with some of our customers is that not only in the last year are they seeing inflation, but they're seeing price increases, and price increases are happening multiple times during that year. So we'll get into a little bit more detail of how we deal with that, but you know, that's one of the biggest things that causes a recession. The one that we saw was excessive debt. That's what caused our housing bubble aspect. We had assets, so the dot-com, you know, in the 90s when greed was good, according to Wall Street, or too much inflation like we're seeing today as well as in the 70s, or deflation. That's when they saw in Japan a too much deflation that it flipped, and in Japan it flipped over to a high problem of economic recession aspects that they fell into recession because of deflation. And the last thing that they put in this article, which is kind of interesting, we'll get more into this, is technological change. In the Industrial Revolution, when it started in the turn of the century of 1900s, there were some recessions that were happening. We saw the crash of the 20s. We saw the recession through the 30s. And there's an argument in this article about how AI may create the same kind of recessionary reaction as we're going into it and having more and more of that approach. So it's something I wanted to get into is what causes a recession. Now, what's the definition of a recession? The definition of recession changes as we keep going. And if you talk to the president, he says we're not in a recession. That's why I asked the question, do you believe we're in a recession? The industry standard, the economic industry standard is 2 consecutive quarters having real GDP go negative growth. So this came from the US Bureau of Economics, or the BEA. And if you'll see, Q1, Q2, we've seen an actual percentage change from the previous quarter has been negative. So by the rule of thumb, we are in a recession today. Now, that being said, there's other arguments to that. But one of the things you can look at here, and this came from Statista in 2022, so it's recent, even though it only goes to 2021, doesn't show what we're going through right now. We're seeing what the annual rate in percentage of GDP is looking like over since 1990. And you can see the big hitting items. So for example, in the dot-com recession that we had around the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium, in the basic Great Recession that we had in 2008, 2009, then what we saw with the pandemic going on in 2020. So we're seeing some statistics here that show that the recessions actually do happen. Is the 2-quarter a good representation? And in fact, Bank of America has put an alternative opinion on this. And what they've talked about, let me pull that article up real quick here and scroll down to some of the words that were put in here. And it says here, as they note that the criteria for this whole aspects that the BEA works off of covers a diverse set of economic indicators, including real income, non-farm payrolls, all the things that I had put up in this chart. Well, if you look at this chart based on the 6 variables that are going on, then if they're using these variables and they're all seeing an increase in the last couple quarters, then why would there be an argument that we're in a recession right now? So is the indication of GDP in the last 2 quarters an indication of being in a recession? Well, if we take this to the next step even further, Adobe just came out, and this came out literally, I'm looking at my calendar here, just over a week ago Tuesday, on August 9th, Adobe's digital price index. And this is kind of interesting because what they've done is they've looked at the inflationary factors, and what we see for their price index from a year to year over change in this last month, it actually, we're seeing prices go down. We're not in an inflationary aspect, and if prices are going down, in theory then, the Fed has no argument to go ahead and raise rates. And in theory then, if they don't raise rates, the odds of us going into recession are less likely to happen. And when they drilled into some of the details of the different types of categories that are associated with it, I want to highlight 3 of them in specific. And the reason why I want to highlight them is because there's some interesting characteristics related to them. One is the year-over-year price change for them was positive, but the month-to-month was negative. And what you'll see on this is that the average historical data is negative. And these are the ones that I think wholesale distributors like yourself would be able to relate to. For example, toys doesn't come into play, or home, maybe home and garden, but most of us aren't in the disposable or perishable types of items. We're into a little bit more of the off-the-shelf and non-durable, or the durable product type of arena. And if we look at this, while we're seeing a price change going up year to year, we're not seeing a month-to-month price change going on. So let's drill this down into specifically for wholesale distributors. Now, McKinsey & Company had a couple of webinars that they've done in MDM on their webcasts. I listened in on them, and they actually had an article which we've put on our website. If you're interested, it's one of the articles on our website. And I'm going to drill into this, and we're going to hit this article a couple of times. I'm not going to worry about the category management, but you're going to see here that there's this whole concept that the category teams to operate centralized buying organizations, so forth, those kinds of things. So what is holding the industry back, and why can't it get to the next level? Well, if you look at these statistical numbers that they've got on here and look at year-to-year revenue growth, it's really kind of interesting, because what we're seeing is revenue growth has gone negative, but the gross profit margin has gone positive, and we're seeing a real bouncing back and forth. This kind of lends itself that we're kind of in that transitional phase. Now, this has at least got us level set to where I think recessions are, and hopefully you have got a better feel for what's the definition of recession. But I'm not going to worry about the idea of whether we're in a recession or not right now. What I'm going to make the assumption is whether we're in a recession or not right now, we will be in another recession at another point. And that's where I want to work off of. Whether you agree that we're in a recession or not right now, the question becomes, what do you do and how do you react to being in a recession? Because I happen to personally think that we are either in a recession or on the cusp of one, given the fact that we've had the $2 trillion bailouts, federal spending. There's only one way that you can go is hyperinflation with that. And with hyperinflation always follows with a recession. So let's look at, Investopedia talks about what's the impact on small businesses. Now, you may not think of yourself as a small business, and most Prophet 21 users are less than 500 employees. So while I don't think that is small, you probably don't think of that as small, but most of the world thinks of that as being small. And where that ends up being an impact, what are the things that you should expect to happen? Let's say you don't believe we're in a recession, it's coming up. What's going to happen? Well, based on the history of all this, that slumping sales, credit impairment, bankruptcy, and employee layoffs and benefit reductions are typically the reaction of what happens to your business when this goes on. So don't mean to be doom and gloom, but that's kind of what's supposed to happen. Now, if that's what's supposed to happen, how do you deal with it? Now, I happen to be a huge fan of the Harvard Business Review. They do a lot of great studies. They work on a lot of things that are a little bit ivory tower. But this study was done, if you look at the dates, it was March 2010. So this was done before we ran into the pandemic. It was shortly after the recession that we saw with the huge housing crisis issue. And what they did is they did a year-long project analysis. They analyzed the 1980 crisis, the 1990 slowdown, and the 2000 bust. They looked at 4,700 public companies, and they looked at three specific periods. They looked at 3 years prior. So in the 1980, they would have been going from 1977 to as one period. Then they looked at during the recession period, and then they looked at 3 years afterwards. And what did they come up with out of this study? And I color-coded this on purpose because this is kind of scary if I'm a distributor today and looking at this. If we're in a recession, or it ultimately ends up being a recession, 17% of the companies in that study, now let me go back, who's in the study? 4,700 public companies that were in these three major types of recessionary times. And when they looked at that, 17% of the companies did not survive the recession. They filed bankruptcy, they got acquired, they just went away in some form or fashion. 80% of them did not regain back to pre-recession growth rates in sales and profits 3 years after the recession. That kind of hits home. And then the number on the last one, not only 9% ended up flourishing after the recession. Now, if we continue on this article, now I'm going to bring up this article so that you can see what it looks like real quick. That if I'm roaring out of the recession, and it goes down into some more things on this, and it talks about these 4 different things. I'm going to go into detail on it. It has some of the odds, and it says, how do you deal with this? So the bottom line is this article, in my opinion, tells you how should you react if it's a recession. What should you be doing? Now I'm going to hover over some of these because I want you can, and hopefully you can see it. And if your eyes are better than mine, there was on the right, it talks about 21% prevention. There's a 20% probability of you surviving if you are prevention-focused companies. And those are the ones that make defensive moves and are more concerned than their rivals of avoiding losses. So they're basically in a defensive mode. And an example in this article of this was Sony. And they announced a cost reduction target of $2.6 billion in December 2008. So that's the type of example of what those are. Those are prevention. They're defensive types of companies. If we look at the promotion, they're the ones that invest. So they go and throw a whole bunch of investment out there. and they do a whole bunch of investing into other areas. And HP is the example on that, where they went and started doing acquisitions. They had the largest acquisition in history by buying Compaq, if you're old enough to remember when that happened. They increased R&D expenditures, millions on corporate branding campaign, and $1 billion in developing countries. So they're that type, and in those types of companies that were that promotion focused, they had a 26% chance of surviving. And then there's the pragmatic. They combined a little bit of both, and they just kind of hedged their bets. They didn't want to get out of either side, and they had a 29%, and Staples was one of those, where they basically they closed down some of their underperforming facilities, but they also increased its workforce. So they contained the operating costs at the same time, but they just did a little bit of everything. And then the last one is they combine defensive and offensive moves. And the showcase that they used in this article was Target. And that was in 2000. They increased marketing and sales, capital expenditures, number of stores. At the same time, they tried to reduce costs, improve productivity, and enhance the efficiency. And those types of companies had a 37% chance of survival. Now, if we look at this, and they had a follow-on study to this, and this follow-on study was done in 2019. And again, let's go look at that study real quick here. And you'll see that the article is written by Walter Frick, and it talks about all these things. And they also refer, and I'm going to go into it here, that not only did they just have this one study that they worked off of, but there's also some other 2017 study from MIT, NYU Stern School. And what they were looking at on this specific study was, how do you survive and, more importantly, thrive afterwards? And this is where I'm dovetailing it into what we want to talk about with the technology. And that is, the 4 things that they suggest is deleverage before a downturn. They talk about how cash is king. Get out from underneath your debt. Get out from underneath the things that have it that you have that you don't have cash to be able to weather the storm. Think of it as kind of like a hurricane that's coming. And I've heard the analogy from a lot of people. It's kind of, they're saying, are we in a recession or not? No, we're not in a recession, but we can feel the tropical winds blowing, and Katrina's just offshore, and we know it's coming. We just don't know whether it's going to be a Cat 4, Cat 3, whatever level of recession it's going to be, but there is one coming. And if that's the case, today, start doing some deleveraging before that downturn. Start looking at not spending money unnecessarily, and maybe get some financing. One of the things they talked about was that Amazon, back in the 2001 that was happening, they ended up securing a bunch of debt, indentured bonds is what they did, that if they hadn't done it just before it all hit, Amazon wouldn't be the company that it is today, because they were able to get cash prior to that happening. They talk about focus on decision making. In other words, don't worry so much about what's coming as making sure that you're trying to put all the right pieces in place. Don't have analysis paralysis to try to not make decisions, but focus on the decision-making process and look beyond the layoffs. It's going to be so easy just to start laying people off. You know, everybody's having a hard time back in the pandemic. Oh, we can't hire anybody. We can't get anybody. And then they're going to start doing layoffs. If you look at it, my son-in-law actually happened to work for Robinhood, and he got caught up in the layoffs in Robinhood recently. The layoffs are happening already. Look beyond that. Don't always just jump with the idea of saying do a layoff, and invest in technology. And let me go back to the article real quick here on that one. I want to scroll down to that section that they were talking about on this of investing in technology. And it says here, it's tempting to think of a recession as a time to batten down the hatchets and play it safe. However, it's to encourage adoption of new technologies. And it talks about the ideas that it's why they say here, why do they invest when money is tight? And the economists theorize because the opportunity cost is lower than it would be in good times. That the economy is in great shape, the company has every incentive to produce as much as it can. So the idea of all this is that investing in technology is the best bang for the buck when times are bad. That in reality, you probably shouldn't be investing in times that are good, should not be investing in technology, but it should be doing it at the times when they're bad. That being said, let's move on to how do we apply this technology. Let's talk about some examples. Now, I'm going to be a little biased here, full disclosure. And the reason why I'm going to be a little bit biased is I'm going to focus on the things that we have focused on as Grey Wolf for years now. The first one I'm going to steal from is going to be Epicor's ebook from 2021. If you haven't seen it, it talks about 6 different technologies that are digital technologies for transforming distribution: e-commerce, cloud technology, enterprise content management. The 2 I'm going to focus on, because again, I'm biased, are e-commerce technology and electronic data interchange. Now, that doesn't mean that the others don't. We happen to have cloud. We do everything ours in the cloud. Content management is talking about the idea of the content that you would have from a perspective of like invoices and reports and those kinds of things. And then obviously smart shipping. And if you want to see what that looks like, oh, I have had that happen so many times that Epicor has broken this. I'm going to pull up the actual report this way. I've got it as a backup. That they have, here's what the article actually looks like. And the first one is technology, e-commerce. You know, experienced double digit. Now, keep in mind, this was done in 2021 that they're recommending that you get into e-commerce. And then they get into the other ones. They talk about content management, and they talk about smart shipping, and then they talk about EDI, which, oh, by the way, we're going to get into what is EDI here in a minute. So here is what EDI is. In our definition, EDI is not ANSI X12. EDI is anything that goes from system to system, lights out kind of an environment. Now, this, if we really look at it, look at the yellow bars. That's what makes up the EDI, not the white bars. So EDI could be as simple as you're creating a PO to a manufacturer, putting it into P21, and it goes out to the internet or to a van. It ends up in the vendor's ERP automatically. So it's system to system. It's going from P21 to the vendor ERP directly from system to system. Now, that's one approach. Another way to do it is if we look at it from a customer's perspective. Everybody's been hearing about the marketplaces. That is EDI as well. So if I'm taking and wanting to put product information, or if I'm wanting to get orders from a marketplace, because maybe you've partnered with Amazon or Wayfair or any of the other big ones that we, you know, Home Depot, name a provider that you want to start to work with, that could be EDI as well, because it's simply as simple as a system to system type of integration. Now, one of the things I'd like to show, I'm not going to take a lot of time, this is not a sales pitch kind of a deal, but I want to show you examples of how EDI can work. So let's jump into, bear with me here, let's go over to our Partner Connect environment. So for example, I can actually do through a document tracker, I can look at and say, I've got an order, where does it stand? Well, I've got a purchase order acknowledgement that's been received. I can click on that, look at the purchase order, see that I've got the individual items. None of this was actually created by a human being on a website. This was done through a system to system. And one of the things I can do is I can then resubmit if I want to, reprocess things. But where it really gets sexy on this, we have just finished and are very excited to announce. Imagine that you've got, and by the way, this is an actual PDF file that has come from a P21 distributorships customer called Smith Electrical Supply. By the way, the names have been changed to protect the innocent. But Smith Electrical Supply has sent an email to a P21 user, and it includes all the basic information. So for example, quantity, units of measure, what's the price they expect. This is a pretty standard PO that has been emailed into a different, or into a P21 company. We have now got the technology to not only be able to take and parse out that email so that somebody doesn't have to key it back in, but we parse out the data. We take the PO number, we take the date, we take each of the SKUs, we take where is this ship to going to be going to, which warehouse is it going to be going to, and then put it right into P21 with no human intervention. That's what EDI is. It's system to system. So it's going from an SMTP, simple mail transfer protocol, or an email system that then comes into a P21 system with a lights out approach that all you're now then having to do is manage the exceptions. The exceptions being something like it's an item that's not in your P21. You've got to go back and have to resubmit it because the item has to be created in P21. But this now has made it very easy for your customer base who works in things like Peachtree or QuickBooks or Mass 90 or anything. They don't have to worry about getting to some EDI standard of ANSI X12. They can just send a standard PO that sends it out to them. All right, let's get back to the slideshow. All right, that's EDI. E-commerce, most everybody knows what e-commerce is, but I want to make sure we're on the same page that that's basically a customer to system. So if we look at the yellow on this one, this is where the customer is going in through your e-storefront, and that's just a generic name, that's not a brand name. And it goes into P21, and the key to that's going to be some of the APIs that have to be done. And we won't get into that detail, but that's the cornerstone to both the EDI and the e-commerce, is that. Let me show you real quick here an actual P21's website, Energy Hydraulics. What this is actually a website that we're hosting for them that you can actually shop by category, you can shop by brand. I'm not going to get into too much of this because everybody's seen it. They've all been on Amazon. But what I am going to show you is that if I sign in, once I log in, I'm actually then going to start seeing items. Let's go look at some hydraulic items, let's say. And let's go accumulators. Now, what I'm going to see here, this price is my price. Now, what this isn't is near real time. This is real-time data. And what that means is this is the actual price for me in the pricing library in P21 for a given unit of measure. In this case, it's for one, for a given ship to, from a given warehouse. All the different variables that go into figuring out that price are all determined because of my login, because I am Jason and I've been logged in. Take it one step further, I can actually go into my account and I can actually look at my open balances. Oh, by the way, these balances are querying directly against the P21 for Energy Hydraulics. I can go look at my invoices. Now this is going to come back as blank because of the date. Let me put in a different date on that so I can actually have some come up. And actually when it comes up, it shows my invoices that are directly coming from P21. I can click on the invoice number and it actually then allows me to reorder from those items and create a whole new order from it, all based upon P21 APIs, which, oh, by the way, are Grey Wolf APIs. And we can get into more detail as time goes on if you have some questions of what those APIs actually look like. Okay, so that's the e-commerce piece I wanted to talk about. Now the last piece that we've just started getting into as Grey Wolf is we are getting into this concept called product management. I told you I was going to come back to that slide. McKinsey is now starting to push this really hard. And McKinsey has a actual, there's all the guys that are out there that do some sort of industry consulting, guys like Indian River and so forth. But McKinsey has gone a different approach. And what they did is they did a study of 140 publicly traded global distributors. And one of the things in this article, and I can show it to you real quick, is they saw that there's a 1% improvement in cost of goods. A 1% improvement in cost of goods sold. So if you can help lower your costs, it increases your EBITDA by an average of 18% across wholesale distributors. Now, how do you do that? How do you go after that 1% cost of goods sold? And what they're talking about, they use the term content management. I'm gonna jump into that presentation or that article again real quick. And what they talk about is this concept of category management. And if you look it up in the dictionary, what category management is, that's basically management of a multiple set of products. And what you're going to see is they've got a series, and again, this article is available on our website. They've got a whole bunch of strategic approaches, resetting it. How do you deal with the idea of a category manager? Think of that as being a product manager. and can be reimagined so that product manager gets into things like marketing and category strategies and assortment management. Think of that as being your buyer today. And if that's the case, what is it are the product management drivers? Well, one, there's a growing complexity of customer requirements. Customers are asking more, and maybe this is the Amazon effect. They're asking for more information on the products that they're looking at. There's ever expanding depth and breadth of product assortments. All this information of products is getting to be so overwhelming. There's inflationary environment that's driving uncertainty in the products and a talent gap in the product managers. Now, by the way, I put brackets on product managers because of the terminology they have as category managers. But think of it as, if you have a product manager, if you have a buyer, anybody that's responsible for the product, they now have become the cornerstone to the success, according to McKinsey, that they're the cornerstone to success. Well, what does that mean? There's a new term out there called PIM, Product Information Management, and we happen to have a solution for that. Basically, what that's saying is, in this PIM database, the user, instead of going into the P21 database and managing it there, they go manage it in the PIM database and let the PIM push to all the appropriate places. Maybe you're pushing it to P21. Maybe you're pushing it to your storefront. Maybe you're pushing it over to a marketplace like Amazon or Wayfair or whatever. And we have just come out with a new product called Keystone. What does it look like? Well, here's what it looks like. It basically says that I've got a series of assets associated with it. These assets could be data sheets. So for example, I've got a series of data sheets out there that look like this. And by the way, I can have all of them, drag and drop, import, export, and I can then have a series that of different categories so I can look at different types that I want to work off of. I have maybe images. So if I look at, these are the digital assets, it's called a DAM, digital assets management. And I'm hovering over to show that you can see all the different images that are inside of these different folders. I then have these assets and I work off of data objects that they could be things like attributes, categories, or products. Let's go look at a given product. So for example, I've got this product called a PC 1300. And in here, I have a series of elements that are associated with it. So for example, it's a Pro Alkaline D 12-pack, but maybe I happen to sell in Canada as well. And I put the French Canadian words in there as well associated with it. So you can see that I have alkaline spelled differently. There's some differences in there. It's been translated. I have general information like what's the SKU, what's the list price. I can have categories. This is associated with my e-commerce. What categories do they fall under? What attributes are associated with? What media? And then if I go look at my media, maybe I want to go into my batteries under the images, and I've got different images I can look at here, and I want to take this one and I drag and drop, and that's now available as part. It's a pointer, it's not copying it. And when I save and publish all this, including the attachments for spec sheets and maybe what integration I want to have, once I save and publish it, I then as a product manager can say, I want to push to Altitude, which as a reminder, Altitude was our e-commerce solution that I can push all the products, push the categories, push the attributes, or maybe I want to push to P21. And now this becomes my single source of information. It's a one source of data that I don't have inconsistencies between what's in P21 versus what's on my e-commerce site versus what's being presented on Amazon. So this whole PIM concept is starting to really raise its head, and McKinsey's starting to say this is what it should be looking like. So now that I've gone through this all fast, and I do want to open it up to some questions, and we're getting close on the time. In summary, let's take what we've been talking about. First of all, recessions are a fact of life. They're going to happen. We may not be in a recession right now. You can disagree. You can agree with the president. You can disagree or agree with the BEA or with the Fed or whomever. But the bottom line is recessions or slowdowns are a fact of life. What goes up must come down. To be successful, be a progressive company. Don't just try to batten down the hatches. Don't just try to sell like to start spending money like a drunken sailor. Find some combination between those two and become a progressive company. and then be able to thrive after the recession by being cash rich before a downturn. And that's not always going to be just don't spend money. That may mean go get financing. Focus on your decision making, look beyond the layoffs, and most of all, look at investing in technology, because that's when the opportunity, according to McKinsey, which is a strong consulting organization, that's the time to be looking at investing in technology is now, not only when it's good times. We will be at Connect. Very happy to be at Connect. We're going to be in booth 33. We had a scheduling conflict. So if you're going to be there in San Antonio, we will not be there after the or prior to the actual the special night that's the social event. We're only going to be there for the cocktail hour the first night, and we're going to be all day there on the second day. We're going to have to miss the cocktail party, and we're going to have to miss the third day. And I apologize for that. That just ended up being a conflict that we had. We have already got it on our calendar for 23 and 24. Cheryl's been kind enough to share those dates, so we won't have a conflict going forward, or should not have one. Now that I've gotten through all this, and I know I've been told I talk way too fast, and I apologize for that, but hopefully, Cheryl, we've got a couple questions hanging out there we can go through.
Yeah, and I think you've given us a lot to think about at the very least right now. So, and that's what I love about your sessions. You and I guys spend a lot of time talking, just aside from just being at Connect. We just catch up on the phone. I think sometimes you call and this will be a 2-minute conversation. Half an hour later, we're done. You know it's true.
Absolutely.
So yes, and it is unfortunate that we had the scheduling conflict for this year, but I'm super glad that you're still able to come for at least part of the event, because we couldn't do it without you. So you were talking a little bit, I know we talked a lot, we covered a lot. So what is your integration like with P21?
So there's a concept called APIs, which is Application Programming Interface. And what does that mean? There's two ways that you can actually integrate with P21. One is a store and forward, or ETL approach, extract, transfer, and load. Think of the scheduled importer as being that approach. The other approach is through a set of APIs, which Epicor is now starting to drink the Kool-Aid on APIs. They've got their middleware layer. We got involved with our own set of APIs about 6 years ago because the APIs from Epicor weren't doing the job. What they are is basically the glue that makes the integration happen, and it's acting like a headless user. So it actually allows programmatically to read and write from P21 so that you can actually see things real time. It's a customer installable solution. It's a customer installable piece that basically allows us to see that information. And it's very affordable. It's $500 a year. It doesn't require a server on premise. And we support both the P21 and the P21 cloud environments to be able to read and write from P21 to exploit the additional technologies that aren't available in P21. So that's what the APIs look like. Good question.
Well, and the question came up, and I always hesitate to ask this question, but can you talk a little bit about your pricing structure?
Sure. We started out in the world, we used to start out with being on premise, and we would charge a fee. If you look at our e-commerce solution, most companies that you look at that we compete with are going to charge in the $20, $30, $50,000 range to get started. And what they're going to do is they're going to give you an off-the-shelf solution for that. And then what ends up happening is you're responsible for the adoption. There's a book out called Consumption Economics, and what the idea is that as a software company, we should have as a partnership with our customers. So what we've done is we've gone to a subscription approach. So Altitude is $180 a month. That includes all the integration with P21. Now, obviously, it doesn't include the APIs. Like I said, our APIs are $500 a year, but it's $180 a month, and you may end up spending $20,000. In fact, we've got a customer right now out of Canada that is spending in that order of magnitude because they're putting basically a custom e-commerce solution together based upon Altitude, and they're taking that architecture and building on it, making it specific to their requirements, so that when it's all said and done, the adoption hasn't been thrown over the wall by the software company. We haven't just thrown it over the wall and say, hey, if it's not being adopted, we'll take your money and run. Instead, we'll take it and work with you as we're building that solution for you. So our pricing model is very much affordable. And oh, by the way, I don't know of another software company out there that has all of their pricing on their website. All of our pricing is on our website, including our professional services rate. So if you want to know what our hourly rate is, go look at our block of time and you'll see our hourly rate. So we are very transparent on our pricing. Any other questions?
I don't have any other questions right now, actually.
Okay. Well, that being the case, I mean, we've got a few more minutes, but see if anybody has any questions and I'll be glad to answer them. Otherwise, hopefully, people will be glad to hopefully take the time and track us down in San Antonio in a week and a half.
Yeah, I just double checked my email. I don't have any additional questions that have come in that way either. But
Okay.
as we just talked about, if you're coming to connect, make sure that you take the time while Rick is still there, and take a moment to stop by his booth and say hi. Too bad we don't have too much time for a coffee, but I don't know when you get in, actually, Rick. When do you get in?
I actually get in the night before on Sunday night. Yeah, I get
Great.
in Sunday night. Yep.
So
So I'll be around.
anyone who,
I'll be around all day on Monday, even if we're not in the booth. So if you want to try to get together one-on-one, I'll be around on Monday all day.
yeah, and you got the contact information up on the screen, so make sure you take a minute, send him an email, and set up a time for a coffee, and take advantage of the time even before the conference has even started, up until Sunday evening. So thank you for today. I appreciate your time so much, as always.
Thank you, Sharon. Look forward to seeing you in a week and a half.
Yeah, see you soon. Bye.
All right, bye.